Hey, greetings from the county line. Good to have you back. We're out here in the shop today. And we're going to have some fun because regrettably and irresponsibly, I haven't taken the time to script out a program this month, not one. So I just want to talk to you about some things that I've been thinking. I kind of wanted to get this to you last month, but some scheduling problems prevented that from happening. But you know, May's a big month in Indiana, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. We got the big race and around Memorial Day, and that typically marks the first day of summer in Indiana. People will be putting their sweatshirts away, they'll be opening their pools, there'll be barbecues, and a week before Memorial Day, the American Legion post number 414 in Burlington went out and visited 6 surrounding cemeteries and placed American flags at the headstones of every veteran they could find. It was a job that kept them busy until almost dark. Then on Monday, they gathered with an honor guard and a rifle squad and went out to the same cemeteries and rendered taps as a remembrance for the sacrifice that these guys had made, these people. For people of my generation, the baby boomers, whose fathers served during World War II and the Korean War, it's hard for us to think about Memorial Day without remembering our war in Vietnam, which was a just war. We got involved because of what was called the Truman Doctrine, which pledged that the United States would defend democracy anywhere in the world. And when the French, who had ruled Vietnam for decades, was pushed out by the North Vietnamese in 1954, our government stepped in to help. And it was a civil war. It really didn't have anything to do with us, except that South Vietnam wanted to be free. They didn't want to fall under communist rule, which was the goal of the North Vietnamese. And it was a memorable time for everybody who grew up during that period, whether you wore a uniform or not, because you couldn't get away from it. It was in the news every night. Casualty figures and body counts and pictures of villages being napalmed by our bombers. And later, stories of the war protests, which started out peacefully enough because young people wanted peace. And they had unlike the protests that we're seeing right now on our college campuses, everybody had a vested interest in this because we still had a draft. People were being conscripted into military service so that they could fight in this war in Vietnam. About 40,000 American men were drafted every month. And by the end of the war, excuse me, my dog's bothering everybody here. By the end of the war, over 500,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines had served in Vietnam. But even if you weren't paying attention to the news, and you were on a college campus, you were still affected. And sadly, even if you didn't wear a uniform, there were still people who can be mourned today. During the latter part of April 1970 and the first few days of May, there was a protest on the college campus at Kent State University in Ohio, and it started out peacefully enough, but then it turned violent over the weekend, and protesters set fire to the ROTC building and burned it to the ground. The governor called in the National Guard, and on Monday, May 4th, somebody lit off some firecrackers among the protesters. The guardsmen, thinking they were under fire, returned fire, which is what soldiers do. you know, we often lose sight of the fact that soldiers aren't policemen and policemen aren't soldiers. They're trained to do two completely different things. And for soldiers, when you're challenged with a threat, the thing to do is to answer with as much force as possible. And that's what these guardsmen did. Over 60 of them fired into a crowd of protesters, killing 4 students who were later found to not have anything whatsoever to do with the protest. They were just kids walking back and forth from class. David Crosby wrote a song about it. So we can't forget that. That was in our face all the time. It was even in our folk music. The Vietnam War was everywhere, and it affected everybody, and it was an awful time in our country. Even in the middle-class, suburban West Side Kokomo neighborhood where I grew up, you couldn't get away from it. Every one of my childhood friends, big brothers, were drafted. Every one of them. None of them filed as conscientious objectors. None of them ran off to Canada. None of them, to my knowledge, burned their draft cards. They just did their duty, as their fathers had, during the previous wars. Brian Butcher's brother David went into the Army after he was drafted, and he didn't come back. I'm sorry, David wasn't killed. Apparently, something happened in Vietnam, and he just didn't want to come home, so he didn't. His family said he was living someplace in Arizona. John Bender's big brother, Fred, saw his draft number coming up, enlisted in the Army, was guaranteed a job as a military policeman, and served his entire hitch in Germany. Pretty good deal. When he came back, he had a very successful career at General Motors, and then when he retired from that, he took over his mom's real estate firm in Kokomo. David Matchett grew up right down the street from David Butcher and Fred Bender. And he was a big kid, played football for Kokomo High School very well, very successfully in the early 60s. And when he graduated from high school, he went to work for Chrysler. He was taking classes over at Ball State because he wanted to be a high school teacher and coach football, something they loved. And then his lottery number rolled around and he got drafted and went in the Army. And in January 1968, word came around the neighborhood that David wasn't going to be coming home. He was killed in action on January 19th, 1968. Every time I'm in my old neighborhood and I drive by his mom's house, and she lived there for many years, even after David's dad died, the place just, it was like a graveyard. Even on the nicest days, the yard was always mowed, the shrubbery was trimmed, but the door was always closed and the curtains were always drawn. It was a sad and solemn reminder that something awful had happened. A few years after that, well, many years later, I met another Vietnam veteran. Gary was a normal Kokomo kid, I guess, and when he graduated from high school, he, of course, was registered for the draft. He was working at a gas station out at 26 and 31, and his numbers were getting closer and closer, and he knew he was going to get called, so he just enlisted. And he was sent to Vietnam. And like most real heroes, Gary doesn't talk much about what happened over there that caused him to come home with a Bronze Star for valor. All I know is that it involved a bridge that his platoon was guarding one night, and that nearly every member of his platoon was killed. But Gary survived, and he was recognized for bravery and valor, and he came home and got his job back at the gas station. Started taking classes on the GI Bill out at IUK. Things were going well. Except, you know, he was a little older than a lot of the kids in his class. So to fit in, he started letting his hair grow out, shoulder length, started wearing a field jacket, the one he had been issued for Vietnam, and was just trying to get along. When one day at college he saw a notice on the bulletin board indicating that Indiana University was going to start a brand new program, calling it police science. Gary looked at the classes that were being offered, thought they sounded interesting, and to kick the whole thing off, the university had invited a number of representatives from federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies to come out to the campus and talk to students about their opportunities in police work and law enforcement. Well, Gary thought, that's perfect for me. I think I want to do that. So he signed up, made an appointment actually to talk to a representative from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Setting his goals, his sights pretty high, admittedly. Time for his appointment rolled around. They'd set this FBI agent up in a classroom. There was no mistake in the guy, Gary told me, because this was back, you know, during the early 70s, during Hoover's FBI, where everybody had to wear the same dark suits and skinny ties and white shirts and ripple-soled shoes. And the agent was doing something at his desk, and he looked up and saw Gary, and Gary introduced himself, stuck his hand out to shake it, and the agent just stared at him, didn't even put his pen down. He said, "Can I help you with something, son?" And Gary told him what he was there for, and the FBI agent just shook his head and said, "We don't want anybody like you in the FBI." So Gary walked out after standing there for a few minutes with his mouth hanging open, and went out to his car in the parking lot and just sat in it. And finally he fired it up and he drove up to Schrock's Honda and traded his car in with his school book still sitting on the front seat and on a brand new Honda 350 motorcycle. He went back to his apartment, dashed off a note to his landlord, rolled some stuff up in a blanket, and climbed on that motorcycle and headed west. He didn't come back for 3 months. He said he rode about 10,000 miles, saw some people he knew from Vietnam, met some new friends, slept on front porches and under bridges. And then his story just ended. He came home, he went back to college, he eventually finished his degree in criminal justice and served an entire career as a probation officer, an adult probation officer, in part helping veterans readjust after they come home from combat. He served a very useful life. So I asked him after he told me this story, and I thought about it for a few minutes because sounds like really quite an adventure. Gary, where were you going? Were you running away from something? Were you looking for something? And he looked up at me and his eyes were moist and he said, "You know, I never had the guts to ask myself." So Gary came home from Vietnam, had a great life, contributed. Leslie David Matchett didn't. We need to remember all of them, not just on Memorial Day, but every day that we get up in this country and have our freedom. And these two stories, I think, illustrate better than any I can think of that it's true, while some gave all gave some. That's it for this week, folks. See you back in the shop next week. God bless you.